Ladies and gentlemen, we do thank you very much for your attention, and now we invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy the
Welcome to our top travel destinations. I am your host, Kevin Flanagan. I have been editor of the weekly travel news column in the Sunday Independent and the Fine Wine and Food Guide, and I am here to use my decades of experience to help you know exactly where to stay, eat, drink, shop, and explore when visiting the world's top travel destinations. So sit back and enjoy the wonders of travel as we take off on our magical journey together.
Welcome to Kevin's Travel Stories, and this week we are going to visit maybe the most exotic place I have ever been to. Yes, we are going to Nepal, where the Himalayas kiss the sky and Everest looks down on everything else. I'm going to tell you a very interesting story about Everest, but first I want to tell you about the city that I visited, Kathmandu. It's one of the oldest towns in Asia, said to have been founded in 167 BC. The legend is extraordinary because you have these great mountains as you fly over them in the plane. They seem never ending, and they're at the same level as you, 30,000 feet in the air. And what happened in the legend is this great basin underneath the tallest mountains in the world was filled with snakes. Yes, the lake, the Nagdaha, was filled with these snakes, and it took the great god, the Bodhisvita, who came along with his sword and drained the lake, and thus the rich and fertile plain was born. And then we had the birth of Kathmandu. It is a most extraordinary history. From the 4th to the 9th century, you had the Likavi kings that looked after it. But the real movers and shakers were the Mallas, who came after that, and they built these extraordinary temple complex, pagoda temples. And the country of Nepal had this unique history of never having really been invaded. They were such fighters. They came into the 20th century in 1959 by joining the UN. And then there was quite a big battle between the monarchy and finally the Marxists. So you had the right-wing monarchy, you had the left-wing Marxists, and in the 2008 election, the monarchy were voted out. And now it is a working democracy. But then, of course, came this devastating earthquake in 2015, one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded on the Richter scale, which destroyed not only Kathmandu, but over 600,000 buildings across Nepal. Can you believe it? I can still remember, I happened to be visiting the Nepalese tourist centre when news came through, and they were absolutely devastated. So it was always one of the great bucket lists I had to be ticked off was a visit to Kathmandu, and very luckily at the beginning of 2024 I went with my great friend and pal Diamond. I met him in Bangkok and we took a flight to Kathmandu. Now, arriving in Kathmandu is not easy. The safety record is the most dangerous airport in the world, the worst safety record. Just the day before, there had been a crash of a plane that was taking off from Kathmandu. And as we flew in, we could see the blue tarpaulin that covered the remains of this cargo plane. Only one person survived, the pilot. So that made for an interesting landing. I can assure you, when you're flying into a very, very small airport, right in the middle of the mountains, and you know that a plane has crashed fatally the day before, it makes you sit up in your seat and look out of the window. But actually, Kathmandu is beautiful from the air. You have all of these small little holdings, a lot of blue on the tops of the buildings, and you're surrounded by these incredible mountains which you've passed over as you come in if the weather is good enough. So we landed. There was a small welcoming committee because I had hired a guide. We were treated like royalty, actually. Garlands were placed around our necks and people were bowing. We found this very touching, actually. So myself and Diamond went into the center of Kathmandu, and there we settled into a very simple hotel. You have quite expensive hotels in Kathmandu, but overall it's poor. And there is poverty there. And what really keeps it going, I think 80% of the money that keeps Nepal going is donated by various donors, the UN, because they are still recovering from this devastating earthquake. And they need the tourism. Tourism is huge. And if you're not involved in tourism, you are actually then involved in the agriculture. So it's one or t'other, actually. So do go there and support them. And I found that that is something you can actively do. And there is so much to see. It is one of the most magical places I think I've ever been to. Let me just give you a quick flavour. Let's start off with the flavour of the food. It's sort of, I think, slightly restricted Nepalese cooking. We did try that first day, the momas, which is these wonderful dumplings that you did. And then you have the chatamazi, which is like a pancake, aloe chop, potato fritters. It's fairly basic, and they use spices to zap it up. And then from a drink point of view, they do a really interesting rice beer. And another thing they did when one of the temples was butter tea. I kid you not. This is tea made with butter. I took one sip. I got that gag reflex, only because I'm not used to it, I hasten to add. It's nothing to do with the actual tea itself. It's just that our taste, Western influenced taste, is used to sugar and salt, and this was quite a shock to the system. The thing about Kathmandu which really hits you over the head when you start off with it is the noise. When you go on the streets, you take your life in your hands because there is very little restrictions on who is allowed to drive on the road. So when you drive down and you're walking down these narrow streets right in the heart, visiting one of the temples or the great shopping areas where you get wonderful silks and carved wooden things, and you're mingling with quite a lot. If it's climbing season and trekking season, Kathmandu will be filled with people en route to the Himalayas, Annapurna, Everest, base camp, or just trekking. The other great crowd of people will be going down to where, of course, Siddhartha, the Buddha, was born, a 2-hour drive away. But there's plenty to see in Kathmandu. And again, we were just slightly out of season, so there weren't too many of the trekking and mountaineering brigade. There is quite a big sort of hippie population there. Kathmandu has this extraordinarily refined oriental reputation, which I really, really loved. But you do see the destruction of the buildings as you walk around, and the streets, and there's big rifts in some of the housing and cracks, and you really get a taste of just how much under the cosh, literally, the people of Nepal and the people of Kathmandu have been, and how much they've suffered. So it is great to go out there and give them part of your business and support them through tourism, because it is a place you will not regret going to. So what were my highlights? Well, I'd have to say it was visiting the temples. We did go to some of the local eateries. We did meet locals who were delighted to talk to Europeans and to Irish people, and they were very welcoming. And we have offers to go back out there, myself and Diamond, and trek and climb Everest if we want to. Maybe that's for another day's work, and we'll do a podcast on Everest. But you can do a 7-day trek to base camp. So you need 7 to 10 days if you are going to Nepal, fly into Kathmandu, and then go trekking. You probably really want to put aside 2 weeks, but I don't think you'd regret it. If you're staying in Kathmandu itself, there is a very, very beautiful place. There's the Park of the Moon, where you can sit and have cocktails, and there is quite a refined area for tourists who want to spend money. But then you have the temples, and I think this is the meat and veg of a trip to Kathmandu if you are not going the mountain route and you just want to stay and absorb the atmosphere in this great Asian city, which again is surrounded to the north by China, the east by India, and to the west by Thailand. So it's a landlocked nation which has such a proud tradition and has always repelled invaders. They're a very, very proud people and a hardy people. And when you do go to Kathmandu, I'm going to suggest you visit the temples, and there's 3 temples in particular that could actually help change your view, your worldview. And this is really what is so great about travel. The first is the monkey temple, which we were taken up by our guide on the first Saturday morning we were there. And this literally, believe it or not, is filled with monkeys. Now, monkeys are sacred, as the cows are sacred. No meat is eaten in the land of Nepal. You can have chicken, you can have fish, but the cow is sacred because of the Hindu tradition. So the temple up on the hill overlooking the great city of Kathmandu is filled with these raucous monkeys. You get the baby monkeys clinging to their mothers. You get others coming along and trying to take food from you. You have to be careful. You know there is disease and they can attack if they're provoked. But there was something quite magical about just standing there, surrounded by monkeys, and then the great candles that you can light, the great prayer wheels you can touch, the whole atmosphere of devotion. I just breathed it in. In the monkey temple, do visit the place where they do the mandalas. There is a wonderful shop and a master workshop, and there they do mandalas, which are these Buddhist reflections. They can be made in sand by the Buddhist monks, who spend weeks making these intricate patterns and then blow them away with a sweep of the hand, and that symbolizes the sudden end of life. It was very interesting that on this trip, it marked the death of my best friend, which was happening unbeknownst to me while I was visiting the temple. So that added a certain sort of sorrow and a peak to the whole experience, I see in retrospect. The monkey temple was absolutely wonderful. And then you go back into town, and again, the roads are so dangerous. You walk along, and there are bikes that continually clatter in, around, and about you, on top of you. They beep every single meter of land they cover. Someone is beeping at you. Then you have cars. Then you have lorries. But it's the bike. They're like mosquitoes. It's like being surrounded by a swarm of mosquitoes that are attacking you. Quite extraordinary. But you have to just keep your wits about you. Make sure you have your medical insurance, just in case. Tourists have their wings clipped by the bikes and the scooters and the motorbikes. But if you can survive that, you can get yourself by foot into some of these other great temples. Now there's the Bodha, which is this huge stupa, a Buddhist temple right in the heart of Kathmandu. It's one of the biggest stupas in the world, which is one of the great burial chambers. It has some of the remnants of one of the Buddhas. It's full chock-a-block with people making devotion. I saw one of the biggest prayer wheels. These are the wheels that you turn with your hands to mark the prayer and to mark your moment of peace with the Buddha. And that was where we had our butter tea. But the real amazing thing, quite life-changing for me, was a visit to the Hindu temple of Pashupat in Ath. Now, this is one of the most sacred sites in the Hindu world. And we went there and were swept along because it was a great feast day of Shiva, one of the great gods, the Hindu gods. And there were tens of thousands, all in their saris, all in their fineries, all with their religious markings, and it was something to behold. In fact, I have a slight claustrophobia. Once I was nearly crushed to death at a big football match in London when I was very young, and I've always had a horror of crowds since then. And I was swept up, and I had to hold on to Diamond's shoulder, and the two guides sort of flanked me just because I was worried I was going to get crushed. And there are crushings at these huge festivals because there are so many people and they're all in a heightened state of devotion. But let me come to that. As we were swept into this river of people, I can remember breathing in the smell, the incense, the colours. On either side, as you went deep into this ancient temple, which is 2,000 years old in some estimates, parts of it, you had the sadhu. And these are these strange men who are sort of like the clowns of a king, who sit there smiling. They are to remind you of the other side of life, the strangeness of life. They're bedecked with long hair. A lot of them are stoned because they do smoke marijuana. That's part of their enlightenment, apparently. You give these guys a few rupees, you give them some money, and they will bless you, and you pose with a photo, which is a new thing. I didn't really have much time for that, to be honest. And some of them look so stoned, I didn't really feel a blessing would really be that valid a contract, to be honest. But we passed the sadhu, and we slowly came down to the bridge which is over the great river. Now here is where the life-changing moment happens. Firstly, you're aware you're entering sacred ground when this huge bullock was sitting on the ground, blocking most of the bridge. It was as big as a Humvee car. It was huge, and it's sacred, and people bow to it and just touch it. It looks at them with its big horns, and it's tethered to the wall and lives a life, a sedentary life, basically. There were a few more sacred cows tied up nearby, and you pass these, and then you come to the river yourself, and then you see something that you cannot easily forget, because here is the site, the sacred site, where when one of the families of the Kathmandu, or people who have died in the surrounding area, they're brought here on wickas, and they are washed ceremoniously, their corpses washed in the river, the sacred river, and then they're placed on these plinths that dot the side of the river. It was funny because there are posh plinths, so you could have the sort of the Kensington, the Champs-Élysées, to have your remains to this earth cremated. And then down a bit, there are the ordinary working class plinths. I thought it was interesting that there would be such a distinction made when the body has passed on, but such is life. Now, part of the richness of celebrating death in Asia and in Nepal and in Kathmandu in particular, the temple of Pashupatinath is sacred, and you can see it in the air. Now, a lot of people have questioned me and said, but this is very ghoulish, isn't it, seeing people being burnt? I don't think so. We all have to go this route. And I think one of the great things about travel is you get to see this. You get to see it absolutely close up. And I found it was really touching and moving. The body is prepared, rice is thrown after the washing, rice is thrown on the face, they're wrapped in linen, they're placed on sandalwood, which is expensive, and it gives a sweet smell and it's cleansing. There's no awful smell in the air, it's actually just the smell of sort of incense, really, and of course it's all outdoors, so the wind just wafts it away. All you see are these grey, rich burning fires and this grey smoke rising and being blown away by the breath of the gods. And we stood there, myself and Diamond and our two companion guides, and we watched this, and I was deeply moved for some reason. The older I get and the more I've seen death, I've been present when my brothers died, my mum and my dad, and I know that death is part of life. This is a great place to reflect. Tourists do come, and it has a certain notoriety for being the place where they burn people, quote unquote. But I found it much deeper and much more reflective. And as you watch the remains after 4 hours of burning and the fire's topped up and the ashes are then placed in the river, swept into the river, you even have, it's so funny, you have a certain sect of the untouchables that go into the river to try to retrieve any bangles or gold or jewelry or diamonds that may have been on the body of the deceased, the corpse that was burnt. But this is regarded as, again, just part of life, just the recycling, the cycle of life. So it was very touching being there and meeting some of the locals. And I remember there was a young man there who was watching and sitting, and he looked very educated and dressed, and I just started chatting to him. And he was a Hindu. He was a citizen of Kathmandu, and he lived there 22, 23, and he had read James Joyce's Ulysses. That was the common refrain between the two of us. And I thought that was so extraordinary. I'm here, the other side of the world, and I bump into someone and start chatting, And they know James Joyce's Ulysses, which is the paean to Dublin, from where I've just come. So that was the wonder of meeting this combination of noise and smells and spices, and all the time you're surrounded by the soaring mountains and the great Everest and this strange madness in the air. It's a bit like Iceland, Reykjavik. Nepal is on one of the great continental shifts where the actual plates, the great continental plates, are moving. That's what created the mountains in the first place. And here, for those who stayed all the way through for this, I'm going to give you a very, very special piece of knowledge. Everest grows about 2 inches every year because the plates are still shifting. So if you go and you climb to the top of Everest, every year you will be the tallest and the most highest person to have climbed any mountain in the world because it gets bigger. But you don't have to go to Everest, you don't have to go to the Himalayas, just go to Kathmandu. And there you will actually taste the spice of life. And it will change you, like all great travel journeys do.